Hi everybody. Well, as promised, I want to do a lecture this week, and I'm going to talk about Indian country law enforcement or tribal law enforcement on reservations. And I certainly am no expert on this. I have experience with it in investigations that I've conducted that have overlapped with incidents that have taken place on reservations involving both non-reservation members and reservation members. In addition, I've got some friends in law enforcement around the West from both when I went to college in Montana and some people I know who have worked and done a lot of felony type investigations on reservations for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And that's been very interesting to learn about and see over the years. So, tribal law enforcement really is an often ignored part of the criminal justice system. There's a lot of reasons that go into that, and none of them make it okay, but that's just kind of the reality of what goes on. But when it comes to criminal justice in the West, which is where we live, we're in the West, tribal law enforcement factors in. It factors in significantly, in fact, in that there are different jurisdictional boundaries, there are different laws, and the way that works, and the long history of who has had law enforcement authority in reservation areas all factors into how we deal with that and what we do. Let's talk a little bit about the jurisdictional confusion that can happen when it comes to tribal law enforcement. We'll start with, is it a felony or a misdemeanor? Well, if it's a misdemeanor, the case is going to belong to the tribal police, and it's going to belong to the tribal courts there on the reservation. But if it's a felony, all of a sudden the jurisdiction falls to the federal government and to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. So now the FBI is going to come in and they're going to investigate whatever crime has happened. How about this? Are the suspects in the case, are they Native American, are they tribal members, or are they not? Were they driving through the reservation and committed a felony? And how does that impact who prosecutes the case? I'll give you an example. When I was in college, I majored in agriculture. I think I've mentioned that already before. And I had some good friends that I knew in the agricultural field who their parents had a cattle ranch in northeast Montana, and the ranch was actually located on a reservation, but they were not Native American and they were not members of the reservation, but they were allowed to buy land there and then lease the land that they ran their cattle on. Well, there was a lot of different rules there. For example, their land, if any one of the reservation or the tribal members wanted to come onto their land to hunt or do something like that, they could. It was tribal land, and they were allowed to go onto that land whenever they wanted to. If a tribal member got pulled over for, say, driving under the influence of alcohol, but they got pulled over by a local law enforcement officer, a sheriff's deputy, even the Montana State Highway Patrol, then all that officer could do was just hold that person and detain them until a tribal law enforcement officer arrived and took over that investigation. And how about this? Is the crime going to violate tribal law? Is it going to violate state law? Or is it going to violate federal law? Or maybe, is it going to violate all three? Because that happens sometimes. Well, who's going to prosecute it if that's the case? A lot of times these issues come up. These issues come up with regular municipalities as well. I'll give you an example. The city of Boise has its own city ordinance that prohibits reckless driving, but so does the state of Idaho. So which one do we use if somebody's driving recklessly? Do we cite them for the state code? Do we cite them for the city code? If you're in the city of Boise, those decisions have to be made. Reservations offer some pretty significant community and social problems as well. There's drug abuse, domestic violence, a lot of different substance abuse with alcohol and things like that really factor into what goes on these reservations. The sole authority on reservations to investigate felonies belongs to the FBI, but there's some issues inherent there. One, federal agents, the FBI agents, are mistrusted by and large, and what are they to do when they get there and no one will cooperate with the investigations? Also, with the substance abuse levels that take place on reservations, it's difficult to get reliable witnesses sometimes, so it makes it very difficult to prove cases. And federal law enforcement priorities aren't always focused on Indian country. They're focused on terrorism, they're focused on illegal immigration, and those resources are not focused towards Indian reservations. What's interesting about this is I've got a pretty close friend who worked for the FBI in Montana for several years, and he investigated these felony crimes all over the state on Indian reservations. And there's a lot of violent crime taking place in very rural areas. If you think about what reservations are, they're generally very rugged, open, vast lands. They're not urban areas. They're not even close to urban areas, really, for that part. But there's a lot of violent crime taking place there, and you wouldn't expect to find that. So that's taking place in those areas, and those violent crimes are going to be felonies, and so they're going to have to be investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, there's some statistics put forth in your book, and I want to end with this because I found it very interesting. From 2006, there were 5,900 or 5,900 aggravated assaults on reservations throughout the nation. Now, here's what's interesting about aggravated assaults. There is a researcher and an author named Dave Grossman, who is a retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army and also a professor at West Point. And he writes about killing. That's what he writes about. He wrote a book called On Killing. He wrote a book called On Combat. And he has a research group and a website called Killology.com, or the Killology Research Group. And basically what he does is he studies the impacts on soldiers and on law enforcement officers of being in deadly force situations in combat. And he looked into what was going on in our nation because our murder rate had been plummeting for years, but he thought, this can't be right. There's a lot of violent stuff going on out there. And what he saw was that even though our murder rate was going down, our rates of aggravated assaults were going up. So how could that be? Well, it's all paramedics. It's emergency room medicine. It's paramedics in the field, and it's the ability of emergency personnel to come out and take what used to be a wound that would kill a person and now save their life and keep that wound or that injury from taking their life. So when I say in 2006 on reservations throughout the United States that there was 5,900 aggravated assaults, think of it in terms of that could have been thousands of homicides that were prevented by emergency medicine. So with that said, of those 5,900 aggravated assaults, only 558 of those cases were even referred to federal prosecutors. So that means these were all reported to the FBI. And I'm not making a judgment on the FBI, but then the FBI went in and conducted their investigations. And less than 10% of them did they think they could get a prosecution on. So they didn't even present them to the federal prosecutor. Just 558. And then of those 558 that the FBI took forth and gave to the federal prosecutor, 320 of those cases were declined. So that means 238 of those original 5,900 aggravated assaults were actually prosecuted. It doesn't mean that those people were convicted. It just means that those cases were actually prosecuted. 238 of 5,900. That's not much. There's a lot of violent crime going on in Indian country. A lot of substance abuse, domestic violence, drug abuse, violent crime. And there's very little accountability going on. Very few of these cases are being prosecuted. And so it's creating an interesting dynamic and an interesting situation in these areas where these people are not necessarily living with the same protections of law that we're all afforded for a number of different factors. So I thought that I would bring that up and let you think about that a little bit. And just wanted to say, just good luck. I hope this week goes well. Please contact me if any questions or anything like that comes up. I'll be here for you to answer any questions and do all I can. Thank you.